Yeah, very warm welcome to this evening contribution. It is the final element of our conference for our meeting of anthroposophical book publishers and librarians and people working in publishing houses. And some other friends joined us. And for those who were not part of the meeting, since yesterday in 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we had many conversations and contributions about the future of book publishing, reading, studying, and the elements needed for this. And of course, in the difficult situations of the society of the world, and with the decline of the selling rates of the books worldwide, and the domination of the internet and many other things. But it was not a frustrating conference. It was about sharing experiences and also lightful ways of going into the future, and very encouraging also these publishers coming to the Goetheanum from South America, Argentina, Greek, many other countries, coming here together and sharing a common task, how to bring anthroposophy in a printed version in letters as a cultural deed to mankind, to education. And I think it is a very interesting element that we close here in Haus Schumann, because this is now the main seminar house of the Goetheanum for these students coming every year from many countries of the world to study anthroposophy, the fundamentals of anthroposophy, the sources. And very practically, they also meet in the morning here at 8 and read together. And for some of them, it is a discovery of reading. Of course, they were all reading at school, but partly at university. But then sitting together on such a text and going deeper into the substance and sharing in the group, this is how the days after singing and so on start here. And during the day, it's not only about reading, it's also about experiencing. And many co-workers and leaders of the departments of the high school, that means of the sections, giving contributions, making seminars. So that's happening in this Haus Schumann. And maybe if you are interested, there is also the program. We are encouraging young people to come from all countries, and very touching, they are not all young. So I think in the last trimester we had 2 retired professors. Very interesting. It's such a wonderful professor coming and teaching education for her whole life in Asia. And at the end saying, I was always so deeply interested in Waldorf education. I had never the chance. Now I come. And also good for our students is that they are here for 9 months, some of them 6 months, or even shorter, and they are present on the hill. That means they see the farmers coming to the conference, and they are allowed to go in to the conference. They see the curative educators coming, and they are allowed to go in. So they see the professional groups, and they see that it's a real school for spiritual science with its practical applications. Applying anthroposophy is maybe not really the correct word, but it is a kind of incarnation, it's becoming a living deed. And they see those people worldwide who just bring it into action. So they live here on the hill and have seminars and meet people and have a time of reflection and deepening. And then they have to go, of course. This is always the problem if you are in a very good place, that you have to go sometimes. Go back to their countries or wherever they decide to go. But we all think it's a seed for the future, for the biographies and for the anthroposophical impulse. And the house, maybe to end this, is one of the last deeds of Dr. Steiner. I came over the sketch for the house, the drawing, and he did it after the last address. So Roland Halfen, a very important co-worker of the Rudolf Steiner archive in his last books, because he died so early and unexpectedly, was about the houses around the Goetheanum Dr. Steiner designed. And to Haus Schumann, I could see there that he published a drawing that Steiner prepared this building on the 29th of September. So Michael time before the sickbed started. And I also realized that that it was built then in Steiner's sixth time. So Max Schumann moved in March 25. So whenever I'm here in the house, which has a wonderful sight here, and looking to the Goetheanum, it is also one of the last deeds of Dr. Steiner, gifts, we can say. Yeah. Now I will bridge to the topic. I think in the title it was Rudolf Steiner, translated by Andrej Biely and Svetlana Geier. Yeah, this is close to the German title, which has a little different aspect. But in 1975, there was a very important book published first time in German, Verwandeln des Lebens is the German title. It was published in Basel. The author is Andrej Biely. Transformed Life is probably the English translation. So 50 years after Dr. Steiner died, half of a century, and I remember to that book last year because it was another 50 years. Svetlana Geier translated Biely's manuscript, typoscript, into the German. And she once said, there is a third person alongside. So the original, the translation, but the third one is the translator. And we had we talked a lot about translations, or not a lot, but we talked about in this meeting, and the importance of a human translator. The translator as a human being, maybe using tools, but the most important existence that's him or her. So the translator between the original and the translation, she said. And so she was the third one. Not only Steiner and Biely, but Svetlana Geier. And I will give, it is not a true lecture, it is a kind of a sketch about Svetlana Geier's path of becoming the translator of that book, and a little bit about Biely, and at the end, some quotations of the book. So hopefully the poster isn't promising too much. But at least it's wonderful to see. It's designed by Nicolas Grebles, the young Svetlana in Kiev. The young Boris Bugayev named himself Andrej Biely. And Steiner is not on the poster, but is the theme. I will start with Svetlana Geier. Some of you, it was mentioned one time in our conference, some of you saw the film Die Frau mit den 5 Elefanten in German, the lady with the 5 elephants. It is not about Africa, or it is about translating Dostoevsky, because the film about Svetlana, also the trailer, and the trailer is on YouTube, you can all see it tonight, but I think not the complete film, but the trailer, you can see that she's presenting the big volumes of her books, of her translations of the major works of, so these are the elephants, these are Dostoevsky books. She's quite famous, and we talked about translation, and good translators. And I think Svetlana would say, yes, have a look that you really find good translators. It's not enough to be a deep anthroposophist and maybe not enough to be a specialist for Biely. You must be also a specialist for translation. And then it's getting very difficult if we need this competence that somebody who is translating an anthroposophical work, that should be grounded in anthroposophy, grounded in the author or in the book, and then maybe by destiny grounded in the art of translation. Then maybe we can't find people anymore. So Svetlana was unique. I knew her quite well, which was also by accident or by destiny. And it's a touching story. And I will start there because Kiev is still a site of deep sorrow. And she was born in the Easter time in 1923 near Kiev, 26th of April. I mean, these are days for anthroposophists. We think about the first Easter festival after the burning of the Goetheanum. Maybe you remember when Steiner suddenly started with a lecture about the spiritual cycle of the year. Now, all of you know these imaginations of the seasons of the year. The spiritual cycle of the year, it started on the ruins of the Goetheanum on the first Easter after the destruction. And many other things, but it's not my main topic. But she was born, she incarnated at this time near Kiev, Svetlana Mikhailovna Ivanovna. Yeah. And then the family moved to Kiev when she was around 6, if I'm right. And at this time, when she was about 6, she was already learning German, which played a role in this high cultural family. So born in, we would say, Ukraine, in the Russian language, but incarnating into German. And she went, still as a child, she once had a dream in German about a German king, she told in an interview. She grew up there, but when she was 13 years old, there was a big shock in the biography. Father was arrested in Stalin's great terror action. He was a scientist, a plant breeder also, and for 1.5 years he vanished in one of these prisons. So this side of Russia, or the Soviet Imperium, and he came home, but the consequences of the torture he never overcame, and she cared him till he died. It was her task to accompany father dying. And when she graduated at school and started to university, she had wonderful levels of qualifications, golden certificate. She enrolled, inscribed directly for Western European languages and literature, favorite Germany. But at the same time or shortly later, the Germans came, but not Goethe and Schiller, but the Wehrmacht. On a very special day, 20th of September, for me it's a special day, it's the foundation day of the Goetheanum. Steiner always kept it in mind, this 20th of September. They came. 28th of September, day of the last address for us here. Posters were hanging, but not this one, in the city. And these posters, they said that the Jews, they had all together there and there, more or less next day. So Michael Day, morning, 8 o'clock, and they didn't know what will happen with them. Now we know what happened. This is this horrible massacre in Baba Yaga, so very close to Kiev, where they shot down 771 Jews. The German army, the Wehrmacht, mainly the Einsatzgruppe C, and one of the best friends of Svetlana, Jewish friend. At the same time, really same day more or less, she was asked for translation into German, and she came into contact, at the end very close contact, to a German count, who was part of this Wehrmacht, but not one of those killing people, but at least a high-ranked German official. He needed her for translations, and this was the beginning of a deep relationship. And it was a huge privilege for her to serve this probably noble count, and this saved more or less her life. She was translating for a geological institute in the Academy of Science in Kiev, and later on for a German factory. And when the situation became so that the Germans had to, so after 1943, when Stalingrad was lost and the situation was getting more difficult, this German count optioned for her to come to Germany with her mother, because for her she was a collaborator now in this situation, and they had a chance to escape to Dortmund. And there she got, by also this privilege and by her genius, an Alexander von Humboldt scholarship. She was really in Berlin, in the center of the Gestapo, because she needed passports with this stateless mother and Russians. And she got this passport with this protection by this Graf Kersenbrock and his friends, and ended up in Freiburg, im Breisgau, not far from here, in March 1944, at the age of 21. One severe last interrogation in the Gestapo, they didn't want to have her there. A young Russian girl, young woman with a mother, but enough protection that they could stay, and she began to study at university in Freiburg comparative linguistics. First lecture was on the nature of the tragic. So imagine to have experienced this Baba Yaga not as a victim, but knowing, and all this brutality coming from Germany, and then going to Germany, but not going into the Wehrmacht, not going into the Gestapo, but going into the German culture and literature, where there is a strong desire in her mind, going to a German university in the middle of the Second World War, living in a hotel, and then in Günterstal, Freiburg-Günterstal, for those who know a little bit, in a tram, she met a young man with an amputated leg from Russia, a German soldier, lost his leg there in the war, and then they became deep friends. It was Christmut Geier. I'll tell a little bit later, because he was from an anthroposophical family. His father was together with Biely here in building the first Goethe-Anum, in painting and sculpturing. But following her path, first at university was studying, but she was at the same time beginning to teach Russian. as a student, especially after the war ended, of course. And she get a kind of lectureship for Russian in the Slavic department of the university. It was not popular after these 12 years of propaganda against the Russians and the demons from the East and Bolshevism, but she kept the position for 43 years. 43 years Svetlana was teaching Russian language and culture at University Freiburg, but also performed Russian theater with her students after the war. So Andrea is also performing theater, Goethe's fairy tale, with our students. So Svetlana did as well, but Russian theater. So we are in a time where these borders became walls again, also on the level of culture. So it's beginning to get forbidden in Germany. If you are interested in Russian culture, you are probably a friend of Putin. And it's really coming to a certain degree which became ridiculous, or the opposite of the truth. Because in fact, this culture and language is the opposite of this policy, or however we judge it. But at this time, she was re-erecting an element of a Russian culture and language. And from 1933 on, also she was teaching at Karlsruhe University and then in Kassel. And also very important for our pedagogical section, she was teaching Waldorf teachers. And not only Waldorf teachers, also other secondary schools. And a great gift for my life that she came to University Wittenherdecke from 1990 on and gave Russian language courses for students. So I met her first there and later on in Freiburg. But also she was a translator for Russian literature. First publication was in 1957, Leonid Andreyev, in Rowell's classic series. Yeah. 1974, she published a big book from Andrej Biely about his friend Alexander Blok, who died by starvation, hunger, beginning of the 1920s, after the revolution, and these difficult years there. And it's a book of memory for Alexander Blok, Under the Sign of the Dawn, im Zeichen der Morgenröte. And a year later, this book about transformation of life, Verwandeln des Lebens. More famous became out of the anthroposophical circles, of course, the Dostoevsky edition. And maybe the most prominent became this Crime and Punishment. It was for us astonishing when it came out, because the title was Verbrechen und Strafe und nicht Schuld und Sühne. So not guilt and atonement, but crime and punishment. We talked about the importance of these kind of translations or interpretations, and she said, no, in Dostoevsky, in Russian, it is not guilt and atonement. It is crime and punishment. It's very interesting because we talked also about Diepl. If you give in Diepl now, Schuld und Sühne, and you want to have the English one, they give you crime and punishment. So just test it. Schuld und Sühne given into Diepl translation, German to English, it will come out crime and punishment, not guilt and atonement. So I don't know how Google translating works. Maybe her book became so prominent that this is not a standard translation, which is a little bit astonishing, that Schuld und Sühne is now officially crime and punishment. But this is a side remark, only from Diepl studies. So Yeah, and she did then the 5 elephants, not only because she preferred later on Sinyavsky, who is another important Russian author, another victim of Stalinism and so on. And when I met her, she always wanted to talk about Sinyavsky more than about Dostoevsky. But anyhow, late in her life, she became a doctorate, honorary doctorate from Basel University. They were faster than Freiburg, so Freiburg was postponed. A lot of people asked her about Russia, homesickness. She said, I do believe that Freiburg is my Russia. I've never missed Russia. Wherever I am, that is Russia. I don't need close contact with Russians because I'm Russian. These are some statements out of interviews or personal talks with her. She made one visit with her granddaughter. This is also in the movie, to Kiev and to St. Petersburg. It was not an easy life, especially when she lost her son Johannes, who was a Waldorf teacher in Freiburg and had a horrible accident in the craft studio there, and was really severely damaged also in his central nervous system. And she cared him in this hospital and brought him the Russian food and was cooking for the son. And so she died in 2010. Translation, our main matter. Translation, she said, perhaps the most human of all activities. Because one is always seeking the other. One wants to grasp it, and it always eludes one. So being human means there is another one, and he's different from you. The otherness of the other one. Translating as a way of breathing, she said. A primordial activity. Primordial, we had this, if this is a good translation, but a very basic fundamental activity. Translation is one of the fundamental necessities of human existence. It is not only a need or a problem or a challenge, it is a fundamental necessity. Language are the work of the mind, Humboldt, Wilhelm said. She liked this sentence, dass die Sprachen eine Arbeit des Geistes sind. Brilliant sentence. Humboldt's crowning sentence. To describe language as a work of the mind is, for that reason alone, a perfectly correct and adequate expression, because the existence of the mind can only be conceived in activity in as such. And for her, the relationship between languages, the non-identity, this was the essence. It is not the same. We all know it, but it's good to think about it and maybe also to meditate about it. She said there is an incompatibility. This is always a deficient process. And something is lost. Not only by the limits of the translator's personality. The translator's personality, for her it was the essence, the presence of the translator. So we talked about if it's possible to, and you know how often it is done, that there is no more translator. And I did a big scientific study, and then we came to the moment when we talked about publishing, and then we were selecting the best scientific publishers for this topic. And one of our advisors in Berlin, a famous professor, said, But don't think that if Springer will take it, that there is then, if there is an English tradition, that they will have a translator. He said from his own experience, even such publishing houses on that level use other tools than human translators. So he said, mistrust the big names of the big publishing houses. I won't never forget, and he got the result for one of his books just from, I think it was Springer, if not another publishing house on that level. The presence of the translator. She said once that translation should be alive and have a pulse of its own, but not perceived as such. Interesting that the translation, this bridging or this bringing together, this space in between, it is a real space. And the translator incarnates partly in this space in between. So, and there is something in between. It is not just nothing. But it needs a kind of selflessness, shouldn't be perceived as such, but a pulse of its own. And those of you who know the translation of Dostoevsky by Svetlana, even if maybe we are not good enough in Russian to compare it with the original, but we can compare it with other translation or just read it. And then we'll see there is something in the book, has to do with her. Once she came across a wonderful painting, most of you will know, of Antonella da Messina. There on the painting, Hieronymus, Jerome, in English I think, in the shrine. In German we say Hieronymus im Gehäuse. So Hieronymus, one of the first translators, commissioned by the Pope to produce a new translation, the so-called Vulgata of the Bible, based on the three existing ones, Hebrew, Greek, Latin. And on the painting of Antonella da Messina, he's working in a shrine, but the shrine is in a temple. And there are steps, and you have to take the shoes off. And for her, she said more or less, but she had a lot of humor, so it was not all serious gravity, but it is a spiritual place, translating. So the shrine and the steps and the shoes please off in a temple. So we heard from Udi Levi, we heard from Gilad, some others. If we talk about translation and publishing, we talk also about the logos. We heard it from Constanza Kalix about translation and the logos. So even if it is a worldly activity, and sometimes we use DeepL for maybe everyday things, messages, and so on, but we should know that we are at the same time, and latest, if it's about books or even poetry, we come to the shrine of the logos in the image, in the painting. And very interesting maybe also in this sense that she said, what are the prerequisites, the preconditions of a good translation? First is that the translator completely internalized the text, that he or she is reading it over and over again, making it part of oneself. She's not talking about translating an email from the general anthroposophical section. She's talking about translating Dostoevsky, Biely, poetry, Celan. So not just messages and content, but works of art or philosophy. So reading it over and over make it a part of yourself, internalizing the text. Because this, she said, gives a deeper understanding. First, one must know what one is dealing with. I think highly of understanding, she said in an interview, for that is the very beginning of knowledge. It is a great fundamental discovery when one realizes that there is a gulf between common understanding and true comprehension. Once one has grasped this, one must have the form of the sentence before one, detached from the paper. Only then does one produce the text in the other language. And now compare these activities, these spiritual activities, this deeper understanding with replacing it by artificial tools. You can't replace a translator as you can't replace a human being, we can say maybe, because this deeper understanding, as far as she practiced it, including listening, maybe in the film you will see it, that the other one, she has a dialogue partner with whom she's talking a lot about the translation. So they are working on a translation together. She's the translator, but she needs the other one, and partly he has to read it loudly. She has to hear it. And of course she doesn't want to create a book of Svetlana Geier. This is sometimes the problem with translators or also with lectors. They want to be writers. So sometimes I really ask the lector, why don't you write your own book? I mean, it's my book. Maybe you want to improve it, but in your own sense and style, but it's no more my book. Sometimes I wondered if they shouldn't try to become writers instead of being the censorship and knowing what is the right style, fitting to our time or fitting to their own mind. Schiller would have never accepted, but of course we are not Schiller. But Schiller at his time was also not Schiller. So this is sometimes coming later, this kind of enormous reputation. Maybe he had, don't know if he had lectures and so on. But anyhow, she said to go deep inside, to internalize it, you have to see the whole of the book, of the story, of the page, of the sentence, of course, but not particularize, just to translate the word without seeing the context, without seeing the next sentence and the whole page. There was once a conversation between two old anthroposophists, very wise men, both of them, and it was about that you only can understand the sentence of Steiner if you read the whole lecture. But the other one said, no, the whole lecture course. So in a way, what is the context? And maybe the whole lecture course is also part of a bigger unit. But of course, we try to grasp the principle. One can only hold one's own in a text if, ideally, one keeps the whole in mind with every word. This seems to be a postulate you can never follow, but in a way, I think she was able to. She was a genius as a translator. She was careful and precise, listening to the music of the text, to the breathing, to the rhythm. We started this day with Helene Fink, and we were guests in her little house, working space, and I said she was, as they told me, she was living in the rhythm of Dr. Steiner's words. So she was in the tone, she was in the voice, and Peter Barner explained us a little bit what does it mean to be so on the top of the words and the meaning. So we started the day with this being listening and attentive. I must hear the language, Svetlana said. Understanding alone is not enough. Language is heard. And we heard from from Udi he had to go home now, that also in the Quran it starts with this speaking and listening activity. The first word is about speaking and listening, which seems to be the same word. And for her and her destiny, quite important, she was a translator, but only Russian-German. Only this. I think she was capable of many languages. I don't know, never asked, but this was her task. I believe that German is something incredibly important for Russian, just as Russian could be of immense help to German. Mutual interdependence. She didn't argue politically, because we have studies and articles and papers saying this complete break now in between German and Russian culture and so on is intended by interests of people groups who don't want to have this coming together as maybe a preparation or an element for the future. She didn't talk about how to deal with the Soviet Union at her time. It's about language, it's about culture. But to keep it and to go on. Now, shortly about anthroposophy. Interesting, I found out that it started in the family in Kiev because they lived in a house of a famous mathematician family, Professor Bukreev, and had studied in Leipzig and has a huge library. And the family of Svetlana, they were living there, they rented rooms there. The wife of this professor, she knew the Geier family, the Biely family. So there was first time, but not the family of Svetlana, but those who rented the rooms in the same house. And the daughter of this family who gave the rooms to them was the director of the university library of Kiev, including Rudolf Steiner. And the grandmother of Svetlana lent the books there. And so Svetlana saw the Steiner books, but there were no Steiner books. They were kind of special editions. There was a shelf in grandmother's shelves, all lent from the university library, with not that many books on it. They looked like music books. They were all wrapped in paper, and some were only typewritten. I showed you in the morning in Helene Fink's house these first editions, and there were also this typewritten one. I read a little in them, but didn't understand at all what they were about, even though they were written in Russian. So this was one of the first Russian, I wouldn't say editions, but Sergei Prokofiev once told me how he traveled all the time to Kiev and to Ukraine when he discovered anthroposophy in young age, because there was a translator living from German into Russian, and she could serve him with many lecture cycles of Dr. Steiner in Russian, and they had this typewritten element. Now she met the man in the tram, Heinz Geier, Christwart Geier, and the father, I said, was a painter and a sculptor at the Goetheanum with Biely. So even in the book, Verwandeln des Lebens, she found the father of her husband described. And the father of her later husband, this Heinz Geier, had a special relationship to Russia and went and also to see the Russian anthroposophical friends in Moscow, Sabashnikov, and also the family Voloshin. Very interesting. And Steiner had seen this little boy of this painter. So this Christmut, she married Christmut, and therefore Svetlana Geier. this little boy was seen by Rudolf Steiner. So in a way, she married into an anthroposophical family. And therefore, she came across anthroposophy. She remained in a way, critical is not the right word, skeptical not at all, but in a way, I had not so many conversations with her about anthroposophy, more about Russian culture, and not so many at all. Once she came to the Ida Weckmann house because I gave a lecture about Asya Turgeneva, and she was befriended with Asya. And there was a certain distance. She also said to me, you know, such an enormously gifted artist, Asya Turgeneva, but she lost her high level because she became too close to Steiner. So she lost her own contribution to the arts, serving the anthroposophical impulse. And this was critical in her understanding. This was, but she knew a lot about anthroposophy. And of course, one of the most striking things she said for her was that at a certain point she realized what we had today several times in our conversation, that Steiner was a translator, she said. This was at a certain point clear for her that Steiner is a translator, because the spiritual teachings, the origin is not German. So Steiner translated into ordinary language, and in his case it was German. But the first one was an action of translation. With Steiner, one can see quite clearly that what he does is actually a form of translation. Now I come to Biely shortly. I could not find out, even if I talked to the family, or how she got the manuscript of Verwandeln des Lebens, because it was not published as a book, even not as a Russian book in Soviet Union. They had a kind of an underground culture, so maybe there was kind of a book, but not a real book, on a bookshelf, but I couldn't find out how she got it. She said, I was in a way waiting for it. I knew that something like the transformation of life, Verwandeln des Lebens, must exist. And one day I had 4 kilos of paper on my lap and was told that this was an unedited, unknown Biely. And I thought to myself, well, I could just as easily write a novel by Tolstoy to go with it. But as soon as I read 2 pages, it was immediately clear to me, this is Biely. I was prepared for this book, but the fact that it landed on my lap, of all places, was beyond my control. It really is quite undeserved. And in another time she said, I was waiting in Sofa because I thought there must be something by Biely in which this very hysterical man brings his relationship to Steiner back into balance once more before it disappears from his inheritance plan. She knew quite well Biely's biography, which maybe most of you don't know. And there was a time when he was fighting against Steiner inwardly. It has a lot to do with Asya Turgenev. I will tell in 5 minutes maybe. And then he had the feeling that she is distancing from me because of Steiner and Steiner's influence on her and so on. And he wrote and published negative articles about Steiner in Russian journals and so on. But for her, she knew his biography, she knew Asya. She had the feeling that this was not the last word of Biely. And in fact, then Yeah, it came to her by destiny, 4 kilograms. And she was an expert. You hear it by this sentence, 2 pages, I knew Biely. I said she published or translated a book about Alexander Blok, but she was a specialist for the whole group of around Biely. This Russian symbolism at the beginning of 20th century in philosophy and aesthetics. Before the First World War, there was an enormous movement in Russia, and they linked in a certain way to the Novalis period and to the early German idealism, and there was kind of an impulse. And in the University of Freiburg, in the middle of the Second World War, and especially after the ending, she brought this to the students, this group of symbolism. She discussed with the students after the ending of the war these texts from the Russian symbolism. I know we had spent 14 days discussing whether there are perception beyond the sensory realm, whether they are possible or not, because Russian symbolism spoke of the need to expand the scope of human perception, that through their senses humans not only receive the world, but also are excluded from it. So this sounds very Steiner, but it's Russian symbolism, that the senses are wonderful, but there is more than the senses can give in the spiritual substance of the world. And also other questions about symbolism, about the power of art, the significance of art. There's a potential of life in this movement. She was an expert for this movement, which was strongly related to the question of social responsibility. These were young artists who had the feeling that art is also a social process, and it means to work for a new society and not just doing art for the art. So this was all living in Biely before he met Steiner, and it was living in her before she met Biely. And it was quite clear to me why they all these Russian symbolists, sooner or later, for a longer or shorter time, had to do with anthroposophy, because that is precisely a path that leads the spiritual in the human being to the spiritual in the universe. First leading thought. And that is exactly what they wanted. One of the key concepts of Russian symbolism, now is the Russian word I can't, is transformation of life. In my opinion, an anthroposophical concept. So there was, and this is very interesting from cultural streams, that there was something prepared, and then this horrible war came. And something prepared also, Steiner would have said, to receive such an element as anthroposophy, and it was all destroyed. But by the German army. I mean, also in the First World War, it was Germany, and in the second, the same. So in a way, also, it is part of the German destiny to destroy other elements in Russian culture than the dominant ones. And it was the German government, and especially the military government, who transported Lenin back to Russia to destroy the country by this Bolshevik revolution, because they wanted to weaken the Russian army. Now we know all details. Steiner talked about it a lot, but now we have really historical details that it was a plan of Rudolf, the leading army leader of Germany, to create the Russian Soviet revolution, destroy the country, to weaken the army, that this East European expansion of Germany is possible. This was a concept of the First World War, not of Hitler. He took it over. So because now it's so one-sided what in the political medias and what kind of image is transported and so on. So she was looking to it. a short glimpse on Biely, and then it's getting darker, I need light, and then some quotations from the book, and then you are all released to freedom and evening and having a wonderful time. Thank you, by the way. It was more pleasant without, but yeah, Biely. This is a long story, but not for tonight. This man here, one of the really most important scholars of Dr. Steiner, out of a high-ranked family of Moscow professors, also mathematicians, interestingly, how he came to anthroposophy and what made out of it. But this book is really what she said, that maybe there was a need for him, before he dies, to recapitulate his encounter with Steiner. And it was done by him in 1928. So 3 years after Steiner died. In a very difficult situation. He was living east of Moscow in a Stalinist period, and all very difficult. But he started to write down not only memories, it is much more than memories, and at the same time a priest of the Christian community did it, Friedrich Rittelmeier. And I think these 2 books about Steiner are the best ones from the first part of the 20th century. They are not complete biographies, but approaches to this mystery, who was and is Steiner. And both of them, the Protestant priest and the Russian symbolist, at the same time, that from east and west, or middle, I don't know, bring these manuscripts. And Biely in his foreword said, there will be completed editions of Steiner, collected works in the future. And now we are close to it. And Peter Barna, I think it's very wonderful that it's going on, to be honest. It's good that it's not completed. So I hope that it will go on, first with the letters, and maybe, so it's good if it's not completed, because who can say completed? Boarding can be completed by the airplanes. I always ask myself if there is a missing person, maybe boarding completed, but completed, I don't know. But anyhow, she said there will be one time collected works, and then also very good secondary scholarly studies. One of you said today, and it was honey to my soul, it's a bad word, secondary literature. Because we have wonderful books about Steiner, about ideas of Steiner, perspectives. We heard about Owen Barfield, talking about Owen Barfield, the grandfather, in the Zoom. So there are good studies about that. Is this secondary literature? I don't know. Secondary clothes, okay, but secondary literature, okay. Yeah, so he said there will be collected work, secondary literature. It's not secondary in Russian, it's a better word. And everything, but something should not be missed. One thing will no longer be able to be reflected, the person, unless in the memories of those hundreds and thousands of people who are indebted to Rudolf Steiner, if they had not recorded their memories, however futile their efforts might seem to them in reflecting the fiery radiance of this person, the entire material for a living image of Rudolf Steiner would be lost to the future. That would be a crime against humanity, against all those who will come to him of their own accord in the future. I was touched by these sentences because I was one of them, I would say. I grew up totally out of anthroposophical surrounding. No one in my family till today has any clue what anthroposophy might be. No interest at all. So the family where I come from, not my own, but so I was totally pure. And also my school time, anthroposophy, I never heard the name. It was nearby Stuttgart. Anthroposophy thinks Stuttgart is the center of anthroposophy. Maybe, but I never heard about it in my gymnasium. And when I went to the theater, and I was reading books, but no anthroposophy was not present. Maybe the wrong bookshops or Gillard's bookshop was not in Stuttgart, is not in Stuttgart, so it's in Tivon, far apart from Stuttgart. So I never came across. When I came across, more than 21 years old, I was deeply interested in the sentences, in the word, in the work, but directly asking the person behind or the writer. Now, Dr. Steiner said to us, a good book is a dialogue between the author and the reader. And indeed, I wasn't interested in details if his cousin or the second wife was, no. So biographical details were not of interest for me, but the incarnated Steiner, the person, the morality. Insofar the biography, because as I believe each biography is a destiny path. So it is an expression of an individuality. We shouldn't lose ourselves in the details, but we need a living image. I need it. So I was one of them when Biely is saying that they will come to him. He didn't say they come to anthroposophy. He said they will come to him. So with this question, and this is not a question for a guru. I was never touched by a guru element. I didn't want to have an adoration of Steiner with a Steiner photograph over my bed. Never had. Will never had. I wouldn't even have the courage to do it. Who I am to have Steiner over my bed. But the deep interest in this, who brought this gift? And is it really, can you really disconnect this kind of gift from the morality of the seeker behind? So I could understand him. And of course, he and Rüttelmeier, these were two figures for me when I was a medical student and reading anthroposophy. Maybe the most important books, apart from the collected works at this time, were Biely and Rüttelmeier for me. Maybe this is more or less enough about Biely, because she realized before he will die, this Biely, she said hysterical. This is not a bad word, but you have to have a good appreciation of hysterical, what does it mean? But he was really partly sometimes out of himself, but not in the sense of being completely in the spiritual world. He was deeply inside other people, inside processes. So hysteria, in the sense how Steiner used it, also in the first medical course, is a little bit the tendency to go too deep in the outer world and to immerse in it, and with this intensity. And he had an enormous inflamed soul, Biely. But he was a detailed, it's perception. I mean, he could describe Steiner's gaze and eyes and voice, and over years with such a precise mood. For me, the memory of this man is incredible, but also the capacity to perceive. And she was right, that at the end of his life, if he will find his balance again, and he fell in love again and married a second time or real time, and he stabilized because he really was missing Asya Turgenev. And she said, no, I won't go with you to Moscow. They were both here building the Goethe An. And suddenly, more or less suddenly, Biely thought, I have to go home because now the revolution is coming and we have to bring anthroposophy. And this is the destiny of mine is Russia. And she said, I will stay here. This is the new mystery site. So he had to go alone. And he sent letters they were engaged. But the answers were short. And he realized that she's going in another way. He realized it before when they were living together here, that it will come a separation. But they saw each other again in Berlin in 1921. She was one of the Eurythmy group, and he got the chance to come out of the Soviet Union. It was not easy and get a visa for Berlin and met her, but there was distance. And then he had the impression it's all Steiner behind her. But he had a last conversation with Steiner, interesting, 30th of March, 1923, 2 days before Steiner died, and some of us had just been in the room where he died. Only 20 minutes, but he said these 20 minutes, this was enough for 4 years. And then with a peaceful soul, he went home, and home was for him Russia. And the second wife was very important for him. And then he wrote that book. So Svetlana came about the book and made this wonderful Verwandeln des Lebens. Befriended with Asya. Asya died before. Later on, the manuscript from Biely came. They had a pure relationship to Steiner, both of them. This feeling there must be something from Biely, maybe partly out of the sphere of being together with Asya. And then it came, and then to translate. And I would say Biely was also a translator of Steiner, but not in the sense of that he made a book out of him, he wrote a book. But in this book, in these memories, this is also translation, I would say. He created an image of Steiner which was not a copy. And this is another type of translation, I would say. He really took his old perception and worked it through and made something out of it. He never proclaimed to say, this is Steiner. He always said, this is how I experienced him. And this was also one of the last sentences Steiner said when Biely went back home and said, I will bring anthroposophy there in this revolution and give lectures, Dr. Steiner, about anthroposophy, because now all is possible in Russia because the old system is broken down. Sensitive revolutions. Revolutions are not always bad. Sometimes they offer opportunities. He had a feeling, and he did. He gave a lot of lectures about anthroposophy, sometimes without using the name, but opening the horizon. He was very popular. And in one of the last sentences, Steiner said to him, the only thing I want to say, Mr. Bugayev, Biely, never say, if you give a lecture about anthroposophy, anthroposophy says. Always say, as far as I perceive anthroposophy, I come to this. So never this pretension of being one teaching. There is always a scholar who makes something out of it. Translating. And now, if you like, we can have a little questions and comments, but I will end with really simple reading. And I selected today a passage from 500 pages. It's about Steiner's lectures and following Steiner's lectures. And because we talked about books in the publishers' meeting, but there was also one contribution from Israel, from Gilad, out of his bookshop, but not only out of his bookshop in Tivon, out of his experience as an anthroposophist, saying Steiner was also, these lectures of Steiner, this is something, this is art. This is not only a writer, I mean, he was a writer in writing books, but the lectures are a different level, not in the sense of being more or less, but different, how he is creating and so on. And now Biely is describing Steiner and the lectures and following Steiner, because this was for me also a little bit astonishing that so many people heard lectures of Steiner and sometimes they traveled with him. So Biely went to Oslo to listen to Steiner's lecture course about the fifth gospel. I mean, it's far away and you must, who can afford to travel to, and is this a kind of tourism? Steiner didn't want to have anthroposophical tourism, we have these kinds, some thoughts now of tourism, but it will end soon also because of economy. But in a way, but he traveled sometimes with Steiner, and he said, now I will read and not comment anymore. The ability to withstand the deluge of lectures, public, for members, courses, personal, esoteric, resulted from a special learning process. We learned to pick out the main theme and to follow it through all its modulations across different keys, depending on the country and city. Different for the Swiss, Finns, Swedes, Germans. Different according to the cities. In Cologne, he spoke differently than in Berlin. In Berlin, differently than in Munich. The core of the theme transformed, not merely along the geographical horizontal axis, but also along the vertical, so to speak, in that he was reshaped for each individual, for the anthroposophists of an esoteric circle. In class sessions, the theme was treated differently than in lectures to members, and quite differently during a conference. Many cannot understand what prompted us to follow Steiner from one city to another. For my part, I can say that listening to the lectures provided insight into the theme, not through the what, but through the how. I learned how the initial question was developed later on differently in every town, in every circles of listeners. Once your ears had become accustomed to the technique of questioning, we were also able to pick out the most subtle overtones on the public lectures. To hear him speak several times in a single week, to be present at the birth of various themes and their counterpoints, and then not to travel after him from Dornach to Basel or Zurich, that was for a person with a highly developed ear for lectures concerned with the how quite simply impossible. One could do without personal conversation with a doctor, and at times even without studying his works. One need only truly listen to him, and one found oneself in a true universality in which the ear, the attention, and the agility of perception were cultivated. Listening was not a perceived skill. An experience grew. The student faced ever new tasks to activate their capacity for reception. The doctor demanded our cooperation. Our attention worked alongside his. Steiner required that people gather in silence some time before his lectures began. Here he addressed higher faculties. He spoke as the higher self to the higher self. For him, coming to a lecture straight from the dully hustle or bustle was the same as arriving late for communion, hastily pushing one's way through the crowd and rushing to the chalice. I mean, just going to the chalice. Steiner's lectures were first and foremost practical exercises in meditative attention. Having learned this kind of attention during his lectures, we also applied it when studying his texts. So I end this publishers meeting talking about texts and reading texts that he said, Biely, listening the lecture was in a way a precondition or at least a kind of a training, practical exercise in meditative attention. It is all about attention, but how to learn attention. And at university sometimes, because we talked about the misery of education, at the university sometimes I realized that my students are totally attentive if I'm telling them, telling stories. I mean, the stories can be out of medicine or history, not such stories, but it is listening to the voice, to the tone, to the thoughts. And they are not merely interested in books. They are, maybe this is, but back, this is maybe a training. And maybe we need this training more and more. I will not say we need more lectures, but this kind of, we can complain about the deficient ability to read, but how to train it? In a way, we said we have to start to study again, but on the other side, Steiner brought lectures, much more than books. And in so far, I think that the oral tradition in anthroposophy is also very important for the future. So we need the books, but maybe they need a kind of a attention level, maybe which is not all the time there. Even in Biely's time, he said, we needed the lectures before. And maybe not all, but it is good. So maybe take this also in mind about if you think sometimes in the direction of books, that these 30 books of Steiner, a little bit more, this is not a mess. This is not a huge crowd, but we have these 6,000 lectures to prepare the ground. So I hope that you enjoyed to hear a little bit more about this. This was a little bit deep photograph of Kiev. The young Svetlana and the young Boris Bugayev translating the life of Steiner and also transforming your own life in reading, in paying attention. Thank you very much for your own attention.